screening in the Satyajit Rai series of The Golden Fortress, which is preceded by Parable of Two, or Two. And I wanted to welcome Tipu Purkayashla, who is a BAMPFA member and supporter, and he's also a dedicated cinephile who we see a lot of the time here at the PFA Theater, and I know he follows film very, very closely and has for many, many years in his life. He actually grew up in Calcutta, and in the 70s and 80s was reading the poems, essays, and stories written by Rai, and has had a relationship to Rai's work for decades. So I thought it would be appropriate to welcome him to help introduce this film. Tipu.
Thank you, Susan. And thank you, PFA, for this very magnificent retrospective of Satyajit Ray. And as you said, I've been coming to many of these, and I'm greatly enjoying them, and especially seeing it in such pristine prints, large audiences. I was telling my parents about it in Calcutta, and they were so happy that there were so many people coming to see these movies. Sonar Kella was my favorite film growing up, along with The Empire Strikes Back. And I hope it appeals to you as much as it did to me some 30 years ago when I first saw it in one of the early revivals. I was 3 years old when it first came out. Sadly, I couldn't see it then. Ray started writing stories for children from around his early 40s. Given that the movies didn't make a lot of money, these stories are the ones that kept him alive and kept him afloat financially. Every year from the early 70s to the 90s, at Durga Puja, which is the annual festival of the Hindu goddess, it's like Christmas for my people. There would be these new stories published in the special commemorative editions of the Bengali literary and children's magazines. And so these stories were written for children, but really it was read by everybody. There was no age limit there. And it was a ritual, so reading these stories at puja time was a ritual for us, and we would eagerly look forward to that. These stories are all genre-hopping stories as well as novellas. The most popular ones featured a Bengali scientist called Professor Shanku, and the others had a detective called Feluda. In Bengali, Da is a respectful title, which means older brother. The stories are told from the perspective of his young nephew, Topshe. But since Felu, and by the way, Felu's not his real name, Bengalis have this concept of Dakna, which means it's a name that your friends and family call you. It's not your real name, which is the same case with me. Tipu's not my real name. Always gets into a problem at TSA check-ins. And he was so much younger than Topshe's father, Feluda, was, that he was more of a brother than an uncle. Ray gets a little meta with the third member of this crime-solving group, and that's a writer of detective stories whose pen name is Jatayu, which is taken from a character in the Indian epic Ramayana. Feluda, who can be a bit of a know-it-all, as you'll see in these movies, and something which grated me as I grew older, loves to correct the many factual errors in Jatayu's stories. Ray wrote about 40 of these Feluda stories, and Sonar Kella was the 6th one, published in 1971. All of Ray's stories have characters traveling to some part of India or the world, and sometimes even staying in Calcutta. And Ray inserts some rather esoteric trivia in a very fun way. So for a generation of children and adults, these were the National Geographic and the History channels of the time. So back to Feluda. Ray was a big fan of Sherlock Holmes and Tintin, the boy detective in the comic books, which some of you may have read, and which was made into a movie by Spielberg a few years ago. And one can see their influence in these movies or in these books. Like them, Feluda had tireless curiosity and a scientific spirit, and is driven by a sense of adventure and civic responsibility, not money. I wish Ray had some female characters in the books, and that's something which I think a lot of people have pointed out. For the trio all three of them are all saints. Also, Feluda smokes like a chimney, as Ray did in real life. So that part of it also looks a little odd in looking at it today. He was very Philip Marlowe in that sense. But he was also very good looking, 6 foot tall. He was a master of Japanese martial arts, a smart, a deep thinker, a polymath, and he carried a Colt .32. So for all of us preteen boys growing up in the 70s and 80s, he was the epitome of cool. And really, we didn't have any other role model in that sense, because the rest of them are all like sportsmen or some writer and things, or maybe some filmmakers also. This movie was released just after Christmas of 1974. Ray had made children's movie, or actually one children's movie before, Gubigain Bagabain, which was shown here a few months ago, in 1968, which was based on his story by his grandfather. And he had also made a detective movie called Chiriyakhana, or The Zoo, which was in 1967, but he didn't much care for that. He had written his own scripts, Kanchenjunga and Nayak the Hero, and he had made movies in color, which was again Kanchenjunga and Sikkim, the documentary. But this was the first children's movie he made in color of his own work. Since making Gubigain, Ray had made some of his darkest movies, Days and Nights in the Forest, The Adversary, Company Limited, and Distant Thunder. Amidst a violent left-wing students' movement that was tearing Calcutta apart. So Sonar Kella, or The Golden Fortress, was a return to happier times for Ray. As the critic Chidananda Dasgupta wrote, the warmth now lacking in his films of the adult world seemed to have taken refuge in the world of children. Not only the warmth, but the values as well. Values that he cherished but were disappearing fast from the environment around. We're finding a heaven in children's films. So this movie is a thriller come a road movie. It's shot in the western Indian state of Rajasthan. 6 years before, Ray had been there to shoot parts of Gubigain, and he loved the place. The climax is in a town called Jaisalmer, near the Pakistan border. The fortress of the title, the Golden Fortress, was built there in the 12th century AD. The theme of the movie is reincarnation, and Ray was inspired by some research done by a parapsychologist in the Rajasthan University. Though a committed rationalist, Ray handles this with a lot of sensitivity. Incidentally, reincarnation is a very popular theme in Indian cinema, and lots of regional and mainstream Indian cinema have movies which are based around reincarnation. A few other things I like about this movie. It's got brilliant color, and I'm glad that this is a restored version. I'm really looking forward to that. And unlike the previous color movies, Kanchenjunga and Sikkim, which were set in the mountains, so it's got a little muted, little misty color. This is bright desert sunshine. There's a long wordless scene with beautiful background scores. In fact, the background score is it's used in a lot of other places nowadays. Some great humor, mostly involving Jatayu, the writer. It's a short, bald-headed man, including the best use of camels, this side of Ishtar and the road to Morocco. So you'll love those. A lot of the humor involves puns around the Bengali and Hindi languages, so some of it may not translate very well. Though I did see some of the puns on some of the other movies, which I didn't think it would catch, but people liked it. And you'll probably know where they are when you hear a section of the audience laugh out loud. Like in many other Ray movies, key scenes that are shot in this movie are shot in and around trains. In fact, Wes Anderson's Darjeeling Limited from a few years back, 2007, has train scenes also in Rajasthan, which are obviously inspired by Ray. In fact, one of the scenes, which is inside this coach, has a painting, a portrait of Ray hanging from the wall. And the Owen Wilson character has a facial bandage in the movie, which is exactly like that of a mystery man that you'll see in this movie. Ray's biographer, Andrew Robinson, called the performance of the child actor who plays Mukul, with his very faraway eyes, as one of the best in Ray's movies. The movie Sonar Kella is a cultural touchstone for us Bengalis. People memorize the lines of the movie. In fact, this morning, a friend of mine and I were just playing that back and forth among us. And for those of us who live outside Bengal, it transports us back to the old country. It is also the first movie tie-in of a Bengali book and movie, and the cover features a scene from the movie. In fact, I found my copy of it, so this is a very iconic scene in the movie, which you'll see. In fact, as I was reading the first few pages of the book, I realized that it sold 100,000 copies. It's quite a bestseller. And in fact, another interesting thing was a couple of years ago, there was a political storm when the Calcutta police arrested a university professor for forwarding an internet meme using scenes from Sonar Kella, which satirizing a very powerful chief minister of the state. So yeah, it's still there in the collective cultural consciousness of Bengal. It's a very big thing. So Sonar Kella is a movie that prominently features parapsychology, or the study of paranormal and psychic phenomena, including telepathy and coincidences. And I came across a coincidence while preparing for this introduction. I was reading Ray's widow, Bijoy Ray's recently published diaries. And in writing about the pre-production of Sonar Kella, she's worried about the Yom Kippur War going on between Israel and the United Arab Republic at that time. And she talks about how, or she writes about how watching Ray working on the script of Sonar Kella, happy as a child, relaxed her in those stressful days. I hope this movie will take you away and take your mind away from the troubles around us. There's a short film that comes just before Sonar Kella. It's called Two, and that's also part of a trio. The Standard Oil Company sponsored a show called SO World Theater on New York's WOR-TV in the early 60s. And they had 1-hour episodes looking at the culture of a different country. So there's Sweden and Japan and England and even one in the US. The other 2 episodes with Two, which is not being showed here today, featured a performance by Ravi Shankar, who's the famous sitarist and who composed music for a couple of early Ray movies, and of a Bombay-based ballet troupe. Ray was asked to make a film which is going to be set in Bengal but in English, and that's a combination he didn't much care for, so he did this very innovative thing. He made it wordless. It's not silent because you'll see a lot of ambient noises, but it was wordless. And the two in the title refers to 2 children, one rich and one poor. It's as I said, very well done. And one of the children might remind you of Little Opu in Pather Pachali, and the other will remind some of you may have seen this movie, but most of you perhaps haven't. The other child will remind you of the boy in the next Feluda movie that PFA is going to show, and that's going to be next Saturday. I'm going to introduce that one too. That's more of a conventional whodunit. It's called the Elephant God, or Joy Baba Felunath. And if you like today's movie, please come back for that one too. So thank you, and let's begin our journey.